Hello, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm the Director of Digital Learning at JTS. I am really delighted to welcome you to our current webinar series, JTS Alumni in the World, Scholarship and Impact. Throughout the series, we've been presenting alumni from JTS from varied schools who've been having tremendous impact on diverse parts of the both Jewish and general world, and their research has really been a tremendous boon. What we've been doing in the past 2 weeks, last week we looked at egalitarian divorce, and today we are looking at interfaith marriage. Both of these topics we recognize are incredibly fraught and in some ways can be triggering. So we hope that in having these conversations, we're both bringing the issues to light and we're providing a sense of how the movement, the conservative movement, is reflecting and responding to concerns and challenges and evolving. Thank you everyone who's come before. It's always so delightful to have your reflections and engagement in the talks that we're doing. And thank you also to those, this is your first session. We love that you're here. Please join us again. I also want to thank everyone who sponsored or who donated to help offset costs for these events. If you would like to sponsor another event, a future event in the series, just know that sponsorship opportunities are available. You can sponsor at 3 different levels, and this is a great opportunity to sponsor in honor or in memory of a loved one. And my colleague, Stacy Firestone, thank you, Stacy, for your help, just put some information in the chat about that. Today, our discussion is titled, Rabbi, Will You Do Our Wedding? New Approaches to Working with Interfaith Couples. And I think that question is one that rabbis get all over the country and and there are all sorts of ways in which that question was prescribed to be answered. And last year, our speaker today, Rabbi Aaron Brusso, chaired a working group, a committee for the Rabbinical Assembly to look at that question, to look at what are the ways in which we are responding and what are the ways in which we should broaden those responses. And so today we are going to be exploring the outcomes of that committee. And again, we recognize this is not an intellectual exercise and it's a deeply personal topic. And we recognize it could be triggering for people. Today, our conversation will focus on our results and some of the ways in which pastoral responses and clergy responses have been engaged and the ways in which Rabbi Brusso has engaged these responses in his own practice. But, you know, bearing in mind that your experiences can differ, and we honor those experiences as well. We're going to be breaking for questions twice during the session and then again at the end, or maybe we'll be breaking for questions twice. Please send your questions to me. Make sure that they're written as full sentences and full thoughts, because I will be getting a lot of questions, but I appreciate your insight and I can't wait to see the pieces that you are taking away. If you have technical questions, you can reach out to my colleague, Stacy Firestone, by chat. She is available to help you. The sources today are going to be shared in the chat, and they will also be shared in email. Rabbi Brusso will be screen sharing them, so you don't need to have them up, but if you'd like to see them as a PDF, they're in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. In addition to chairing the committee that I mentioned, Rabbi Aaron Brusso has been the rabbi at Beit Torah in Mount Kisco for New York for the past 15 years. He's a member of the JTS's Rabbinic Cabinet and a 2020 recipient of Truah's Human Rights Hero Award for his work in immigration. He is a graduate of JTS's Rabbinical School, and he received his master's in Jewish philosophy from the Kekst Graduate School. Rabbi Brusso, thank you so much for joining us, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for all of your help. We also want to thank Stacy Firestone for her assistance today. And in preparation for this, Julia Andelman and Tani Schwartz-Herman for all they do. It's really an honor and a pleasure to spend time with friends of JTS, a place that I have warm feelings for and helped absolutely was formative in making me the professional I am today. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that regardless of whatever topic we were to talk about today, our hearts are absolutely in Israel, and thinking about the safety and security and well-being of family and friends there. And so I wanted to just take a moment for us to channel our thoughts and feelings towards that very special place before we continue. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I have been having this conversation with colleagues in the Rabbinical Assembly for the past couple of years, and they've been thoughtful and creative and interesting, and it's a joy to share some of the thinking with you. So I'm going to share my screen, and just to let you know that when I have shared my screen and done some Google Slides in the past, inevitably at some point, my screen freezes, so I'm going to have to unshare and get back into it. So I'm just preparing you for the possibility of that moment. Okay, so for 18 months, I chaired a working group for the Rabbinical Assembly called the Standards Working Group. The standards of religious practice were requirements for conservative rabbis to adhere to certain ritual policies that were put into place in the 1970s and 1980s. And as a part of our overall strategic planning, we were looking at lots of policies and governance issues, our ethics code, and in particular took a look at these standards and asked the question, 50 years later, how do these play in the current landscape? So that included listening sessions with lots of colleagues. We ended up connecting with over 200 of our colleagues, learning journeys, and it was a wonderful group who participated with me in trying to figure out what questions we wanted to ask and how to get at the information. In terms of questions, we asked what was the intention of, amongst the other standards, the standard prohibiting officiation of conservative rabbis of marriage between a couple of two different religious backgrounds. And what assumptions did the policy make about how people choose partners and the relationships to communal and rabbinic authority? I'm already glitching out a little bit here. My apologies. So I'll get back in. What roles did sociology and religion play? How important were denominational distinctiveness and ideological legitimacy? How were rabbis positioned as pastors in this context vis-a-vis actual couples and families? And what's the state of play in the field? So we really tried to take a 30,000-foot view of the entire issue as we had conversations with colleagues. One of the things we did was to go back to writings of the CJLS, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and the Rabbinical Assembly from decades ago to try to figure out the origins of approaches to interfaith marriage and policies like the standard. And we found out, not unsurprisingly, going back to the 40s, that there was an attempt to telegraph to the community approval of certain relationships and disapproval of other relationships. That it was the role of religious leaders to not only teach towards certain relationship outcomes, but also to adhere to policies that promoted those outcomes of certain approved relationships and certain relationships we tried to convince people not to enter into. And you know, there were statements, you know, going on into the 60s about dissuading people from entering into those relationships and creating pressures and influences to encourage people to marry other Jews. That then resulted in a policy that started to form itself in the early 70s that no member of the Rabbinical Assembly would officiate at those marriages. And even graced by his presence, of course, that was before women were ordained, but a sense that even going to those things was giving tacit approval, and those are things that we shouldn't do in order to participate in what really was a program of social engineering, of trying to convince people that there are certain relationships that are acceptable and certain relationships that are not acceptable. You may know that in 2017, there was a committee put together that altered the understanding of this standard, that allowed for conservative rabbis to attend interfaith marriages, although not to officiate. This then continued on into the 80s, that the movement was committed programmatically to discouraging marrying outside of the faith, and doing whatever needed to be done educationally to achieve those outcomes, including a sense that we should possibly even create social consequences and sanction to people entering into those relationships. So there was a thought at the time, and I think, it's fair to say that it was intended for good, that it would create a certain outcome of Jews marrying Jews, of ensuring that there would be future generations of Jews who were connected to the Jewish community, and an assumption that if you married someone who was not Jewish, that was an off-ramp from the Jewish community. So 50 years later, looking back at that program and a lot of those assumptions, we concluded that things had shifted significantly. And some of this will probably not surprise many of you. But one thing I think that's important to start with is that there was a lot of pain and a lot of damage done to relationships, a lot of hurt, because of statements about whether someone was considered to be a good Jew or a bad Jew or doing harm to the Jewish people, people feeling that clergy couldn't be available to them during very complicated times, difficult times, painful times, and not knowing how to have these conversations, that there was a clear sense that there was something that was acceptable, not acceptable, but not really understanding how to have a conversation. And so there was a lot of pain and a lot of damage done. And it was not only felt by congregants, it was felt by rabbis, by colleagues, who amongst rabbis really expressed a feeling that this was just a very hard predicament, and wishing for some sort of better approach to the issue. The other thing that over time began to be acknowledged is that interfaith couples raise Jews, and then not only raise Jews, but they raise rabbis. We realized that even though decades ago in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was an assumption that when someone chose a partner who was not Jewish, it must mean that Judaism isn't important to them. That's simply not true at all. That it's possible for someone to love Judaism, care about it, want to live a Jewish life, and to choose a partner who didn't grow up that way. That happens all the time. And many of us rabbis have congregants who grew up in different faiths, who are absolutely wonderful partners in raising Jewish children, including one Episcopalian father who I always think about in my congregation, who cried the morning of his son and daughter's b'nai mitzvah, and just stood there with great pride. And in conversations with colleagues, we had a number of colleagues who said, I grew up in a household of parents with two different backgrounds. And we, in the course of a conversation about the conservative movement allowing driving on Shabbat and certain kashrut policies, and wondering whether we should, be lenient about things, there was a conversation about that. One colleague said, look, I really don't think it's right to talk about my family in the same context as pots and pans and parking lots. This is my family. We are real people. And, you should know my family didn't off-ramp from the Jewish community. In fact, they raised us as committed Jews, and I'm here as a rabbi. And my interfaith parents contributed Jewish leadership to the Jewish community. So these are things that were unthinkable in the 1940s, 1950s, and even 1960s. The other thing that we realize is that disapproval is not really how people make relationship choices. They're not in college, going to a bar or in the city meeting someone at a singles event and saying in their mind, I really need to think about, can my rabbi officiate at this wedding? Will my community approve or disapprove? These tend to be external kinds of factors but that people are making relationship choices that are more core to the question of who they are, who's a good partner for them, and who they want to live their life with. That a lot of these external pressures aren't critical to the decision factors that they bring to the table, or in this case, to the bar. And that a policy position is not helpful when you're actually sitting with a particular couple. Every couple has different stories, and a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach to these kinds of conversations, or a presumption from the outset that here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, here's who you are, here's this must be based on the little I know about you, what's true about you. The policy actually precludes the pastoral from taking place. It actually prevents, in many ways, an ability to get to know people personally. Also, identity formation is different today than maybe it was in the mid-20th century, or at least the way people assumed it happened. There might have been a time where people were okay with the community telling them who they were based on their parentage. You're a Jew, you're not a Jew, you're a patrilineal Jew. Today, it's much more complicated in terms of how people relate to their personal identity. I had a nursery school father who was a psychologist come to my office to talk to me about our approach to patrilineal Jews. His father's Jewish, his mother was not. And, he said, so what's your approach? And I thought to myself, this guy's a psychologist. He's been through more analysis than most people I know, and he's asking me to tell him who he is. When it comes to policies or halakha about identity, there is a great need for tremendous pastoral sophistication in figuring out how to have these conversations, in particular when identity is much more discovered and constructed and presented from the person to the community than it is from the community to the person these days. And rabbinic authority has changed significantly in the last 50 years. It used to be that one's title and expertise put one in a position to weigh in on certain aspects of people's lives. But that's just not the experience of me or many of my colleagues. It's much more in the context of relationship than it is authority. And people first want to feel known and seen and brought into a rabbi's life before they then give the rabbi permission to weigh in on things. And it's, I think, just true that people don't interrogate their beliefs, practices, and behaviors because they're convinced we are right. They interrogate their beliefs, practices, and behaviors because they're convinced we know and care about them. And so first and foremost, relationship has to be front-loaded in all these situations before any policy or position can be articulated. And so we have to figure out a way, and these are the conversations we've been having, to shift from policies to relationships, from power to shared responsibility, from approval to authenticity. And I'm going to unpack that word authenticity as we move on. I don't want you to feel like you have to know exactly what I mean when I say that, but that's one of the big shifts that we've been talking about making. The other thing is that the policies in the past have positioned rabbis pastorally in complicated ways when it comes to family systems. So we often get asked at Kiddush lunch, Rabbi, I have a halachic question, and the temptation is just to answer it because we have the information. But of course, many times the person will say, thank you so much, Rabbi, for giving me the answer so I can tell my brother-in-law how wrong he is. We have unwittingly, in answering your question, gotten knee deep into a family disagreement or conflict and pulled into a family system. And so this is something that we always have to be aware of as rabbis. What is our pastoral positioning? How do we help families to take responsibility for differences, dissonances, and issues they're struggling with instead of taking it upon ourselves? There's a lot of temptation to transfer from a family system, a very complicated, difficult issue, to an external third policy, in this party, in this case, a clergy member, to try to get them to do the work for a family. And so our job is quite often to facilitate and help to give the work back. And in the case of a situation where there's a family member who's entered into an interfaith relationship, what's really important is that parents talk to their children and express everything from a sense of joy that they found someone to feelings of sadness that maybe this person might not represent the religious background that they thought that their child or their family member was going to meet, and what does that mean for their future, and also excitement for getting to know this person, and also a little trepidation. Whatever those feelings are, it's really important that we make space for parents to have that conversation with their children, and for the couple themselves to turn towards each other and say, hey, you know, there's some differences here. What is it? What do they mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? What does it mean for us coming together as a couple and our relationship moving forward? And the truth is, these are complicated conversations. There's a lot that's on the line. And in some cases, these are new relationships all around. And so there is an investment in avoiding sometimes these hard conversations because of what it might mean for the future of the relationship. Will it complicate it? Will it end it? And when we as rabbis have, from the get-go, policies and approaches that our authority is what approves or disapproves, allows, disallows, makes acceptable certain situations, it's very easy for the family to then divert the issue to the clergy and say, oh, you know, the rabbi won't officiate, that's a problem, it's creating an issue for us. And maybe it creates a conflict between the family and the rabbi, or maybe they just sidestep altogether and find someone to officiate. You certainly don't need rabbis these days. Plenty of friends can register to officiate, and you can, you know, circumvent a difficult conversation and interaction with clergy. And so, in a sense, our approach has enabled avoidance of what's really important content-filled conversations and raised the question, how do we help couples and families to own responsibility for these complicated questions, to face them, to take them seriously, and own them, and figure out how to address them moving forward? And how do we reposition clergy from boundary policing to being pastors and teachers of Torah to the couple and this family during a very important time in their life? So we've really been thinking from a high level about our positioning pastorally, communally, when it comes to these questions. I'm going to share one more thing and then I'm stop, and I'm going to open it up for some questions before I continue. So one thing that happened to me as a rabbi that helped me to rethink positioning and how we even begin these conversations. This Episcopalian father, who is just a great guy and a wonderful congregant who I love, was in a meeting that we had years ago for 7th grade parents to talk about their children's upcoming B'nai Mitzvah. And a Jewish father raised his hand and said, you know, when we talk about the honors and we talk about including members of our family, I don't understand why we can't include the non-Jewish members of our family when it comes to having an aliyah on the bima. It feels exclusive. And before I could answer the question, this Episcopalian father raised his hand and he said, have you taken a look at those prayers? Do you know what they say? Because that's not something that I feel comfortable saying. That's your prayer. That's not my prayer. I certainly have my prayers, but this belongs to you, not me. And I think you should take it more seriously. And if you look at the prayer and you look at the second bracha, Asher natan lanu Torat emet b'chayei olam natan b'tochenu, right? Praises God, ruler of the universe, who has given us this Torah of truth and implanted truth, therefore, amongst us as the people of Israel. This is the parallel to the way Christians access eternal truth through Christ, and that Christ is a vehicle for them towards God and eternal truth and eternal life. And Torah for us as Jews is that vehicle. And so this Episcopalian father was pointing out something really important, which is to say that there are issues of inclusion and issues of embrace. And then there's religious narratives, rituals, symbols, faith statements that have integrity to them and power and significance. And the conversation could start from the perspective of, what does this religious statement mean? What does it stand for? And who am I in relation to it? And what would it mean to start the conversation from that perspective? I'm going to pause there. And before I sort of play out the answer to that question, I'll open it up for some questions or check-in from you.
Thank you so much for setting the table. I think it was fascinating just to see that kind of evolution in the movement in terms of, well, clearly in the 1940s, Jewish women, it didn't matter if they married, because it was just about the fact that the children would be Jewish, and then up to the sense of this disapproval and where you are today. So thank you for laying the groundwork for us. The question, there's some questions about statistics and things like that, but I kind of want to start with this grounding in halakha. In looking at this, you were laying out, kind of these scans in community, in sociology. Was there a sense of where legalistically we could go, or where there is room to be kind of more accepting, open?
Sure,
And
yeah.
what was the response that you guys were looking to in that? That was the question.
Yeah, I think that one pathway to answering this question is to look, halakhically, what space is there when it comes to these questions. And I will get at the question of, what is a Jewish wedding ceremony? What aspect of it is halachic, and what's all the other stuff that's a part of the wedding ceremony about? So you'll see that in a bit. But I think the pathway that I'm looking at is a little broader than some of the questions around the halachic toolbox. It's really a question of, what is religion, what's the role of religion, and what is religious experience, which are related to halakha, but a bit more expansive. And you'll see that in the second half.
Okay, so we'll hold on to that one. And this one, I'm guessing the answer is no, but I will throw it out there. Do you allow non-Jews to have aliyot in your shul?
Yeah, so I think that the language, do we allow, it actually prevents a much more content-filled conversation. In other words, what I do is I have a conversation where I will show them the content of the aliyah and say, what's your relationship to this faith statement? And for someone who didn't grow up as Jewish, it really does feel like us going into a church and taking communion.
Mm.
In other words, if the church said we can't take communion, we wouldn't say, oh, I feel excluded. I really would love to. I mean, for the most part, and I don't want to put feelings or words in people's mouths, we would say, like, yeah, like, I'm not going to take communion. That's not my faith. Christ is not my vehicle religiously. And so the question is, for someone who didn't grow up with a Jewish background, is this the faith statement and vehicle for them religiously? And really, it's more the question of, do we put people in a position to make disingenuous faith statements? That's really the direction of the conversation.
In looking at the kind of sociological background pieces, when were you finding, or I know anecdotally, many of us can account for the people like your Episcopalian father who, and a lot of times I remember growing up that there was a Catholic mother in my synagogue who was divorced but had said, we'll raise the kids Jewish, and the dad wasn't even in the picture anymore, and she was still there with her son every Saturday. It was amazing, like that. She knew way more than many of the other congregants about the Saturday morning service. But do you have a sense of how many people in interfaith couples, how they're kind of balancing the raising their kids as Jewish, or is, what are the ways in which that's being framed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time, the Jewish community used sociology, demographics, Pew studies to try to figure this stuff out. I will say, as a rabbi, I never found it helpful because it didn't tell me what I needed to know about this couple or this family. One of the things I've learned over 25 years in the rabbinate is I have no idea what's walking in my door. And if I think I do, I should get ready to have my assumptions completely undermined. And I think that's the right pastoral approach, which is I really don't know what's going to walk into my door. And in taking that approach, I learned that every family has different stories and approaches things differently and requires different pastoral guidance to figure out, where we're going with this. So, for example, if a couple came to talk to me about getting married and they came from different faith backgrounds, I found it really unhelpful for me to say to them, according to sociological studies, the chances of you guys living a committed Jewish life is really small percentage wise, right? Like, it's just the way none of us would want to be abstracted out into statistics. And so I've always felt that this pastoral approach as a rabbi helps to figure out where this particular couple or this family needs to go on all these questions.
I just want to clear something up because I think that there's that in talking about aliyot, we got people a little into the conversation today is not about whether people who are not Jewish should be doing an aliyah. And in fact, the example of the aliyah was just presented as a way of showing that this is not just a random prayer we say, but it's a statement of faith and it's an affirmation of Jewish value. And so it is my understanding that you are saying, no, this isn't about us excluding people from certain opportunities. It's about reframing the question about what is available and what does it mean.
Yes, it's an example of many questions within our tradition, and trying to say, is it about inclusion and exclusion, or is it about the relationship between people's identities and the religious statements and actions that happen in our tradition? And again, like, the shift I'm talking about here is significant enough because we've been trained for most of our lives to think about these issues from the perspective of inclusion. And I'm going to be talking about it from a different starting point. And so we'll see if we can make it clear as I go on.
And I'm sure we will. I think we were getting, from the questions, I could see that there was like, but wait, what are we doing with aliyot? And we're not doing, it was just an example, or it was standing in. So, and it's not just, let's be clear.
Correct.
Do you feel like when the issues are become very different if we're talking to people who are getting married later in life, or it's between widows and widowers, or basically the difference is that children aren't on the table in the same way, that you're not going to be raising a family, that you're past that point?
So I think the questions are actually the same, and I'll kind of point that out in the second half.
Okay, I think maybe let's keep going to confirm and to move forward, because definitely some of the questions that we have will be answered, addressed, and then we can re-explore in the next half.
Great. Okay, so my Episcopalian friend helped me to rethink the question about people who from different backgrounds and their relationship to Jewish community and Jewish life, as opposed to being about what people can or can't do, about the question, making it about the question of religious integrity and how your identity relates to the religious traditions, rituals, and faith statements of Judaism. And so I just want to point out that the sources start to reorient this question of what mitzvot are, what the purpose of mitzvot, what is religious experience, and what does it mean for us to feel like it's ours, as opposed to a different religious approach belonging to someone else, the sense of ownership. So first of all, I shared with you on the source sheet, this first source, that ultimately this question of, for example, kashrut, what does God care whether Jews eat meat that has not been ritually slaughtered, or whether they tear it apart and eat it, whether they slaughter from the neck or from the thigh? Know that God only commanded this method of slaughter in order to unite the Jewish people. So the Midrash in Tanchuma talks about kashrut, and again, this is just one example of a mitzvah, but it could be lots of mitzvot. That the purpose of mitzvot, what we would say ta'amei mitzvot, the meaning of them, is that it's supposed to create a sense of connection between Jews, meaning amongst Jews, that it's supposed to exist in our lives and make a difference in our lives by observing them. The alternative is to say that you just observe mitzvot because that's what God told you to, in a sort of submissive way. The great 20th century Jewish thinker Yishai Leibovitz would say that's sufficient and everything else is commentary. And yet there's lots of rabbis who say actually that there are purposes for the mitzvot, including Rambam and others. And this midrash says that the mitzvot are actually supposed to exist in our lives and make a difference and have an impact. And there's supposed to be some form of religious experience. We're supposed to have an experience in relation to these actions and not just do them for the sake of doing them. I'm going to skip this one, but just briefly say that Abraham Joshua Heschel in Heavenly Torah talks about how sometimes we have religious experiences that are meaningful and sometimes we don't, but that we live a religious life in order to achieve those moments of religious meaning and not simply to do them. Paul Tillich talks about the power of symbolism. He's a Protestant theologian from the 20th century, who says man's ultimate concern must be expressed symbolically because symbolic language alone is able to express the ultimate. Symbols point beyond themselves, participate in that to which it points, open up levels of reality which are otherwise closed to us, unlock dimensions and elements of our soul which correspond to the dimensions and elements of reality. He talks a lot about how symbolism, and this has to do with mitzvot and all of the rituals we do in Judaism, that there's a symbolic nature to them that is not just the act that we're doing, but the meaning beyond the act that it brings us to, right? I'll talk about lighting candles in a bit, but when we light candles, it's not just the fact that we do it before Shabbos, but all that it symbolizes in terms of our relationship to the previous generations, that our mother or grandmother maybe lit candles, and that it creates tremendous religious and intergenerational significance by doing it, not just fulfilling a mitzvah, but all the meaning that accrues because of the symbolism of those candles when we light them. That's all a part of why we engage with religion, because of all the meaning and symbolism that it offers us. And this last source is from James Fowler, from his book Stages of Faith. And I'm going to summarize this, but you can look at the text on your own, because what James Fowler says is what's so meaningful about religious ritual is not that it's in general, but it's in particular. So in other words, we don't in religion talk about love and kindness and justice and God. We actually talk about tzitzit and bitter herbs and a sukkah, right? We talk about very specific things that then, because of their specificity, bring tremendous meaning to our lives. That meaning doesn't come about in general, it comes about in specific. That when we talk about a Passover Seder and the meaning of those symbols, they give us a sense of what slavery and freedom means, not in general, but in particular, connected to a particular narrative and story of our people and how that's played out in our lives and then the generations that have come before us. That all of that accumulates to a sense of meaning that if we just in general talked about slavery and freedom, it wouldn't nearly come to the same sense of meaning. And so what Fowler talks about is the absoluteness of the particular, that a particular religious narrative, ritual, symbol, faith statement, a particular one of those can actually bring us to a great sense of meaning, God, a sense of God's presence, in ways that more general kinds of actions don't. And that part of the power of religion is not its universality and the way that it's similar to other religious systems, but in fact, the way that it's different and distinct. And in all of its distinctiveness, in all of its details, that's where you find the most religious power. So I'm going to give you some examples so that we can actually think through the significance of some of those texts that I just presented to you on religious experience, the phenomenology of religious experience, how particularity and specificity make for powerful religious experience. So how does the particular contain religious power? So if you watch the Olympics and you saw the sailor from Israel, the parasailer, win gold, and you watched that video and you heard Hatikva as the Israeli flag was being lifted, and it gave you goosebumps, I'm with you. I felt the same thing. And you have to know that somebody from Denmark who hears that song does not have the same experience. In the same way that if you heard the Danish national anthem, you most likely would not get goosebumps because of the particularity of the tune and the words and the meaning that it evokes. That's an example of the particularity of religious power. In the same way that a Christian can light an Advent candle and they might feel a sense of religious power that we wouldn't. Us lighting candles at 5:24 before Shabbat and using the candlesticks that our great-grandmother brought from Poland would have tremendous religious significance and different than if you were lighting birthday candles, right? That's where all the religious power is wrapped up, in the specificity and particularity of those rituals. So I'll give you a few other examples to what I'm talking about when it comes to particularity. A number of years ago, I was on the Bima and we were davening Kol Nidre. The cantor was chanting it. And usually my mind is completely elsewhere because, a lot going on. During the second recitation of the Kol Nidre, I don't know why, but I was brought completely present. And as I heard the words in the tune, what I felt was that a realization that there were more Kol Nidres behind me than there were ahead of me. I realized there were more Kol Nidres behind me than there were ahead of me. And that something was calling me home to the place from where I started. That's the best I can describe the feeling I had when I heard Kol Nidre. And if I hadn't been hearing Kol Nidre my entire life with that tune, with those words, that same night of the year for decades, it might not have opened up that wormhole of meaning to connect me to that feeling of ultimate significance in God and where I came from and where I'm going. That if somebody had sung Yankee Doodle Dandy in that moment, it would not have had the same powerful religious experience. And it was because of the specificity that I was brought to that moment. When I blessed my son at his bar mitzvah, I got through it. I was really proud of myself. I didn't cry. I said what I needed to say. But as soon as I raised my hands and I said, Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, and I can already feel my throat here, right? There's something about those words and the specificity of those words and the fact that they have been recited on Shabbos for our kids and baby namings and weddings for decades, that gave me permission and said, something significant is happening in your life, something powerful. And it is being acknowledged ultimately that in your individual life, something is breaking through. And it took the specificity of those words for that to happen. My father and my son and I climbed Masada a decade ago. And I got so emotional at the thought of 3 generations climbing a mountain of generational significance for the Jewish people that connected our, 3 generations to all the generations of our people in a way that if the 3 of us were hiking the Grand Canyon, it would have been amazing, but not the same. And the last example I'm going to give you is I used to teach Catholic educators through the Anti-Defamation League about Judaism from a Jewish perspective. And invariably, at the end of my presentation, one of the Catholics would come up to me and say, Rabbi, thank you so much for your presentation. Tell me what you think about Jesus. What, if any, role Jesus plays in all of this? And I would, when that happened, do what any rabbi would do and say, let me ask you a question, and answer the question with a question and say, tell me what it's like for you to light Shabbos candles. And they would say I don't light Shabbos candles. I'm not Jewish, And I'd say, I just want you for a moment to feel how strange my ritual from my context feels in your context. That's what it feels like when you lift this question about Jesus out of your context and place it in mine. It doesn't have the resonance that it has for you. That's really important to understand, is not only are these things particularly meaningful to us, when we lift them out of our context and place them into other people's contexts, they don't have the same resonance, right? Because people have completely different systems of meaning. So I want to take that idea of particularity that I shared with you through text and the power of religious experience when it comes to particularity and all the different examples, and I'm sure you could come up with your own, of how religion in its specifics has been incredibly meaningful because of its specificity, and ask the question, what is the particularity of the Jewish wedding ceremony? What is the Jewish wedding ceremony? So first of all, we find, in relation to the earlier question, that it's actually a minimum of Jewish law and a maximum of narratives, rituals, symbols, and faith statements. There's actually only one moment, halachically, that's critical. The giving of something of value in front of witnesses, right? The ring part of the ceremony, that's when people get married. And halachically, that's the moment that somebody gets married. But that ceremony is so much more than just that simple moment. In fact, you could just go into the chuppah, have that ring happen, witnesses, and done without anything else. And those people would be married. So why all the other stuff? And what other stuff are we talking about? Well, if we ask the question, it's about Rebecca's story of receiving a blessing from her parents before going to meet Isaac. That's what a bedekin is. The chuppah is connected to Abraham's tent. We have the words in Birkat Erusin at the beginning of the Jewish wedding ceremony, where we say Asher Kidshanu. And this is a moment where we acknowledge that Jewish actions add holiness to our lives. And there's the phrase Mekadesh Amo Yisrael, this question of, do we feel a connection to Jews around the world, of Jewish peoplehood? And why would we want to bring Jewish peoplehood to our wedding? What does it add to the wedding of religious significance? And when that ring happens, we say Kedat Moshe Yisrael, in accordance with the laws of Moses and the people of Israel. And to what extent do we feel claimed by that family and those practices such that we would want to bring that into one of the most intimate moments of our lives. And in Sheva Brachot, when we say Ba'ari Yehuda b'chotzot Yerushalayim, in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, to what extent do those places have meaning and resonance? And why would we want to bring places that are halfway around the world into a chuppah that's about a couple's personal story? Right? Why all of this particularity of narratives, rituals, symbols, and faith statements? What meaning does it add to that life cycle event? So one answer is that it plants an individual story into a communal story of shared meaning, and that you want it because it ramifies love, ramifies commitment, and takes an individual story and gives it significance across generations. So when I meet with couples, I will have a conversation where I'll say, who are you and what's true for you? Who are you individually? What are your religious backgrounds? What meaning do they have for you now? What role do you hope they will play in your future? Have you heard each other talk about these things before? Couples talk about lots of things. They aren't necessarily always in contexts where they share about their religious or faith backgrounds and what it's meant to them and what it might mean to them. In fact, a lot of times couples haven't really articulated it for themselves sufficiently to then articulate it to their partner. And what's it like to hear each other talk about these things? What feelings does it bring up? And what questions do you feel you need to continue to communicate about? How can you continue to develop skills of communication around these issues? And when you think of a wedding ceremony, and in particular a religious one, what do you imagine? Is there a mutual faith statement of commitment that's true for you as a couple, or could there be? Right? By the way, you don't have to get married in a faith context. That may not be the context that best helps you express what mutually brings you together. Right? Like a wedding is not parallel play. A wedding, if anything, is a joint statement of meaning and commitment. So this is the positionality of authenticity. Instead of talking about approval, going back to the statements from the past from decades ago, and saying, here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, here's what we approve of, here's what we disapprove of, it's really starting the conversation from a completely different starting point and saying, who are you? What's your identity? What's authentic to you? What feels honest? And partnering with the rabbi to, first of all, surface and differentiate needs of various members of the family system, right? To what extent are your parents living in your head? When you think about these things, what are you worried about? Like, is it your grandparent? Like, let's take the noise of the family system and let's differentiate needs and turn the volume down so we can turn up your inner voice and say, what's important to you? So that they can articulate their identities and faith commitments individually and as a couple. Then we place the integrity of their identities in conversation with the integrity of the wedding ceremony's narratives, rituals, symbols, and faith statements. And it becomes a conversation of shared responsibility where we surface the boundaries together. What is mine? What is yours? What is ours now? What could be ours in the future? This is a minimum of permission structure from a wedding perspective and a maximum of religious meaning, which parallels the wedding ceremony itself. What is meaningful for you together as a couple? And the results of these conversations that I've had over the years is there's more communication, more learning, and more responsibility. And it requires us to approach things from a completely different vector than we have in the past. Not about what's permitted and what's approved of, but what is authentic, and repositioning clergy to facilitate that conversation with couples and share that sense of responsibility. And ultimately to switch our mindset from approval to conversations about authenticity. Okay, I have shared a lot. So first of all, I want to thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent. There are a number of questions coming in that are just kind of in the nuts and bolts of this. And then also in the kind of realm of like, wait, are you saying that this is going to change? So let me get into where I've been adapting them. You know, how do you engage with that? There is clearly, you're not saying, Rabbi, will you marry me?
One question, Ellie. One question.
I know, it's so hard. There's so many questions. Thank you.
I know. I'm kidding.
And this is when the moderator goes away. So do you think the question when asked, Rabbi, will you marry me? Your question is, let's talk. But when you get to the end of that conversation, what are the roles that are available to you?
Right. So, I mean, I think that question comes by honestly, and we're so culturally trained to ask it that we're actually not positioning ourselves in what I think is really where we should be, which is we should be talking to this couple about who they are and what they're looking for, and how can they talk to a rabbi about figuring that out, right? Because in the end, it's not about what a rabbi can or can't do. If this is done right, ultimately, it's a shared responsibility with the rabbi to come to a conclusion about what makes sense for the couple. And I've had all kinds of outcomes in these conversations. So let me start by saying that, of course, as a rabbi, I represent the power of religious particularity. Okay, so like, am I going to get rid of the whole wedding ceremony and all of the power of its particulars in order to do something, more generalized? And like, I guess that's a move. The question is why, when all the religious power is actually in the particularity. And in fact, the couples that I talk to, they feel so appreciative of encountering the tradition in its power and particularity, and they feel appreciative of the dignity that's given to them to articulate for themselves, the empowerment to say who they are, and in relation to the integrity of these narratives, rituals, symbols, and faith statements, because it helps them, first of all, have much more informed conversations about who they are and what they're looking to do in life. And sometimes they leave just feeling more informed and able to communicate, and that's a great outcome. Sometimes they want to learn more, so we'll learn more together or get them in a context where they can learn more, and that's a great outcome. Sometimes they get to a place where they feel like they want their identities aligned, and they want to both commit themselves from an identity perspective to Judaism, and that's a great outcome too. All of those are great outcomes that position the couple and the clergy appropriately to share responsibility for surfacing authenticities.
So in this work so far, and you've been putting this into practice in your own congregation and your own clergy practice, how much are you working with people from other faith traditions, in terms of other clergy from faith traditions, about seeing their approaches to these questions? Like if it's the difference of a couple comes to you, one is Christian and one is Jewish, are you also talking to their pastor? Are you talking to their priest? Or are they talking? Or is it such a different framework that they're just used to it? How much is it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't emphasize enough how every couple is different. And it's so hard to generalize about these couples. It's one by one by one. Having said that, in the past, I have encountered couples where there are, at least for the member who grew up in a different faith tradition, where they do have a strong sense of connection to that faith tradition. And I will say to the couple, yeah, you absolutely should go talk to a clergy from that faith tradition, so that you as a couple can feel like you're figuring out who you are and where you need to go. That has happened in the past, and that's been a part of the process. But sometimes I'll encounter both from the Jewish perspective as well as the person from a different background, that there really isn't a strong sense of religious tradition there. And so then maybe that wouldn't be a helpful move.
I had this feeling, and this question came up as you were going through all of these ways in which you talk through the service and the ritual versus the legal aspects of it. Do you do these same conversations when they're two Jewish partners?
Yep, great question. Absolutely. The first conversation, first of all, I had a couple come to me, both Jewish, and I did the same thing that I do with, all couples, where I go through, what the Jewish wedding ceremony is, what it represents, and who they are. And two Jews came to me and said, "This is really nice. In fact, even lovely. But we'd actually like to take out the Sheva Brachot and take out the Birkat Erusin and put in, these readings and do these and bring up people to, and basically wanted to reconstruct the whole ceremony." And I said, I don't think you need me. There's, really nothing here that represents the power of religious particularity such that you would require a rabbi to do this thing. And certainly, not the wedding ceremony that contains religious power that I do. And we both agreed, I was not the right clergy or officiant for them, two Jews, right? So I do this with all couples because this has to be what people are looking for and who they are. And whether they come from different faith backgrounds or the same faith background, it should be a statement of mutual faith and commitment.
And the wedding, of all time should be the time that you're really starting on the same page and saying, wait, this is what's important to us. These are the values we hold.
Exactly right. Exactly. Instead of saying we're going to create something that's going to satisfy members of our family and sides of our family, I think that, a lot of the premarital counseling I do is really trying to figure out what's your page and how to get on it and how to figure out how to relate as a unit to those sides of the family of origin that raised you, but from whom you're actually leave taking now.
This actually takes us very beautifully to a question, because you mentioned in the presentation that you're like, what role do the parents have in this? And I think for many of the Jewish members, it's, you're like, they have a clear sense of what the responsibility of a Jewish parent would be in these conversations. How do you engage the non-Jewish parent in the conversation, or how do you bring them in?
Well, again, it depends on the situation, what's going on, and the purpose of bringing them in. Again, every situation is different. I think in general, when I've counseled parents in these situations, well, let's start this way. It's really tricky to be a parent. Full stop. You have a lot invested. And you put a ton into raising kids, and they're your heart. And what does it mean for you to hand over responsibility for core questions as opposed to take them on yourself? There's so much temptation, and I've seen this, where the parents come to talk to me and they say, "Oh, we're so worried about what's going on." And I'll say, "Well, what does the couple think?" They'll be like, I don't know, but we said we'd come talk to you." And I'm like, "Look, you definitely don't want to make it easy on them. You don't want them to be like, oh, so glad my parents are worried about this, so I don't have to. They'll figure out what the answer is going to be." One of the critical things for parents to do is to say, right, this is their responsibility, not mine. It takes tremendous restraint. And look, my kids are at that point in their lives where they're old enough and they're getting there, and I feel it now. I really empathize. And yet the role of the parent is to make sure that these critical questions of identity and authenticity and mutual commitment and faith and home and that they fall squarely on the shoulders of the couple with the assistance of the extended family, but ultimately is their responsibility.
So once you've had this conversation and the couple has gotten married, what are the ways that you continue to make them feel valued and part of your community and your congregation after after this, we come up with these big important conversations. This is a moment, this is a watershed moment. What happens after that watershed moment is done? And what are your
Well,
best?
I think as a movement, we've answered that question a while ago, and we've been, moving in a very embracing direction for the most part. It's really this question of dating, engagement, and wedding that we haven't really developed language and framing for, and that's the core, I think, of what I'm trying to get across today. When it comes to afterwards, I, as many of my colleagues do, have a number of families where the parents are of different backgrounds in the community, and it's a part of the landscape of our Jewish life. And I wouldn't want to be in a community that did not include those families. And so, as Ellie, you were pointing out, I've seen parents who come from different backgrounds drive their kids to religious school, cry at their kids' b'nai mitzvah, stand on the bima, really be full partners in this. And my job is to make sure that what they do feels true to who they are and doesn't put them in a position to make disingenuous faith statements, and to make sure there's integrity when it comes to people's relationship of their identity to the tradition.
I think, and as how is this process? You went through this long, an 18-month committee process, and how many people were involved in the committee?
We had 13, I think, members. Actually, Ellie, really appreciate you putting together the source sheet, and I'll tell people here that on the source sheet, we have two links. One is to the report from the Standards Working Group, and one is to frequently asked questions. The report includes the list of rabbis who participated in the committee. One of whom was Pamela Barmash, I know who you met with last week, who's the chair of the law committee. Some wonderful colleagues participated in it, and you can see their names as well as the report from those links.
And my colleague Stacy is adding those into the chat, so you will have them there. What do you feel like the next steps are? How are you getting this? How are you sharing this with rabbis and communities and putting this into process? Because clearly the work group can say, we need to find a better approach than this kind of sense of we're just disapproving.
Absolutely. And so, in pushing out these thoughts and ideas that we gathered through our work, a number of things are happening. One, we submitted questions to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and you can see those in the Standards Working Group report, to get them to update Shoe Vote from the 1980s that were from the disapproval context, meant to dissuade people from those relationships. You can actually find some of those Shoe Vote, and the law committee hasn't updated those, and it's really time that we shift from approval to these conversations of authenticity, and so they're going to take up some of those questions. Secondly, we have continuing ed professional development for Rabbinical Assembly colleagues for us to talk about these pastoral approaches, and as any good professional organization would, whether you're a doctor, lawyer, social worker, teacher, make sure that we help our colleagues to feel really good about how they're approaching these questions today, and develop the skills that we need in order to make a meaningful impact on the lives of families at a critical moment in a conversation when we have not really been involved in the past. So that continued training is something that we're putting together through the Rabbinical Assembly. We've also formed a joint committee between USCJ and the RA in order to work with the congregations to start to change some of these narratives, and shift away from some of the thinking that we referred to towards some of the thinking that I presented here. So there's some real good efforts across the board to do that, and we've been working with some tremendous lay leaders from USCJ, volunteer leaders, professionals, as well as
for those of you who don't know, is the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and the RA is Rabbinical Assembly. Sorry.
That's right.
alphabet
Absolutely.
soup.
Thanks. Sorry for the alphabet soup of Jewish life, and of course rabbinic colleagues as well. And so we're doing a lot of good work on that.
Do you feel like in terms of, have you had any pushback from colleagues in this kind of opening, or do you
Yeah.
feel like mostly where are your colleagues
Yeah,
sitting?
yeah, for sure. I mean, look, we have first of all, it's not easy to be a rabbi. I hope I hope no one here thinks that, it's an easy job. I mean, it's a job with tremendous meaning, an opportunity to play significant consequential roles in people's lives. And I feel blessed every day to do it. And I think we need more people choosing this as a career. Um, so I want to start with that. It's an honor to play this role. And it's incredibly complicated because the landscape shifts, times change, what you need to bring to the table changes. What we ask of rabbis is, the core competencies, the list of core competencies is like exhaustive. It's just an incredibly long list of things that we expect rabbis to do. And they're doing a lot of it really well. But when we say we really need to change an approach on something, you got 10 plates spinning, right? And then you say to them, okay, we want to retread while you're spinning those plates. That's, anyone who was asked to do that professionally, whatever your career is, if you were used to doing something a certain way and thinking about a certain way, or even developed, something that was different but not quite where maybe we all want to head, it's a lot. It takes a lot to affect that shift. And so for sure, we had colleagues who felt like, this is a big ask of colleagues to rethink some of this stuff through, and coming at it from a love of rabbis and knowing that this is a complicated career, um, you know in general. And so that kind of thing. But I think that one of the things that I came away with most of all was in these conversations we had with colleagues, the tremendous thoughtfulness, the sense of appreciation and care that rabbis have for each other. And by the way, the very different geographic and career contexts in which rabbis function, whether it's the United States or Latin America, Israel, Europe, or campus, chaplaincy, pulpit. There's a lot of diversity there to account for. And so, we held it all.
For those of us in a congregation or who interact with rabbis, what are the ways in which we can support them in this process?
First of all, whoever asked that, thank you. I really think that's the right approach to a rabbi, is figuring out how to support them in this process. I think just ask that, right? When it comes to these issues, how can we support you? And it's important to be patient with people as they figure things out, and to make space for it. I think just the question itself is exactly what I think colleagues need.
One of our participants just said that she has a deep appreciation and respect for your emphasis on conversation, and she specifies that you're an exemplar. Who are other mentors and role models in facilitating these conversations instead of just responding with the answer? Who else are you turning to, and the movement is turning to in this moment?
Yeah, so we've been talking to family systems therapists in constructing professional development, continuing ed programs for rabbinic colleagues. And I think it possibly might be an outcome of our partnership with the USCJ too, because I think some of the work that's been helpful to me, and I know others, has been really understanding family systems therapy principles, which have to do with, triangulation, individuation, responsibility, that sense of what's, my issue versus what's my siblings or my parents' issue, and all the emotions in a family system, and how to position ourselves to be helpful to families, and how to position the tradition and its integrities to be in relationship to these conversations. But that doesn't position rabbis to hold all the authority and therefore responsibility for everything, but to share it, right? It's really the family systems approach that allows the awareness to happen. And what's interesting is that in that process, I think, of opening up and sharing that responsibility, instead of people, I think, taking it less seriously, I have found people take it more seriously. So, when we had quick answers and we have policies, I feel like people have taken this whole thing much less seriously. A wedding is a wedding is a wedding. But in this conversation of shared responsibility, where it's really about what this all means, the integrity and religious particularity, and whose responsibility, everybody just takes everything more seriously, from who they are, what they stand for, what the relationship is to their members of their family system, what the relationship is to the tradition, how their clergy can actually be helpful in guiding them through very significant, important conversations in their lives, as opposed to figuring out a way around it. I mean, it's just upped everyone's seriousness and responsibility, at least in my experience.
Well, I think there's always, I'm sure, more we can plumb the depths of this. In kind of wrapping up, is there anything else that you would like this group to know about? Anything that's that we should keep in our mind as we see these kinds of, and these are not changes necessarily that we're going to see, but it's a process that seems like it is more of a general community building process that hopefully manifests in other ways throughout our communities as well.
Yeah, I would just, hope that people would think of themselves as partners in this process. And, it's going to require, some time and patience as we think this through and help people to rethink. But it's really rewarding work. And just the time that you've given here is something that I really appreciate. So thank you.
It has been such a pleasure to talk with you today and to learn more and just to hear about this process. And I think as someone who got married to a Jewish partner, I'm just now questioning, I'm like, I just wish we'd had this conversation before. This would have been so nice to have this opportunity. So I think in total, there's so many ways in which these conversations can inform weddings and experiences and make them more fruitful and productive, and then establish kind of a spiritual and religious life through the wedding that I'm not sure in my wedding was there. And I hope that future married couples get those opportunities, whether they're interfaith or not. So thank you. Next week is the last session in this series. We will also be having a series before the high holidays, but our session next week is a new understanding of B'Tselem Elohim, biblical text through the lens of disability studies, with Dr. Ora Horn-Prauser. And she's going to be sharing her new writings that are, I believe, coming out soon. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brusso.
Pleasure. Thank you.